Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to the Beastcoast Pokemon channel. We're here to talk about the Portland and São Paulo Regional Championships. Aaron, James, how you guys doing? I know you were both there that weekend at Portland.
I'm doing good. It was really fun. Obviously, Rosemary and we got to commentate the games, and going into Portland, I wasn't really sure where the meta was going to be, and obviously there were a lot of standard teams, but we honestly saw a ton of really interesting stuff on stream. Jumpluff obviously won the entire tournament, which I thought was really cool. Rose and I got to commentate a game with Halucha as well. That team made it pretty deep into the tournament as well. So overall, I thought, yeah, we got to actually see a lot of cool battles, and I wasn't really sure what to expect, but overall, I'm very pleased with the overall results.
Yeah, it was a very fun tournament to play. I think it was funny. I think all three of us were there, and I don't think I got to see either of you two at the event.
I didn't get to see you, no.
Very fun event overall. I had a really good time. I think Portland was really well run, and yeah, there were definitely a lot of interesting trends, definitely different from EUIC when we look at it.
I feel like the one thing that stuck out to me is Palafin balance was everywhere. That felt like the top team composition that people were trying to make sure that they could beat when building for this particular tournament. James, like from your perspective, was that a team that you felt you really needed to have prepped for? And did you even run into it very much when you were playing?
So yeah, EUIC, I think we saw the dominance of Palafin balance, and I felt it was pretty strong throughout, but it's definitely not like an unbeatable team. It definitely has a fair matchup against a lot of the cast. I definitely had a team that I felt was pretty comfortable into Palafin balance, and I think usage stat wise it was actually a pretty common team. It's funny because when I talked to a bunch of players throughout their runs, they didn't really face any, and that includes me. I think Palafin balance, I played one normal Palafin balance and maybe like a kind of a mix of Palafin balance, but I only faced 2 out of like 14 rounds, and I think a lot of players actually said the same.
I have a very interesting stat about the set as well. For day 2 Portland regionals, we saw 4 Palafin across the entire field of 41 players. And Aaron, I feel like we didn't really see a whole lot of Palafin balance on stream either.
Yeah, what's interesting is even though there were only 4, like they all ended up actually still performing fairly well. 7th and 8th place both had Palafin teams, as well as 9th place. And so 3 players made it to like the 11-3 record. Peter Chen, who had the really interesting Halucha team, I believe finished 10-4 with it. So, I think it's still a really good Pokemon. It's just clear that a lot of top players are now opting to not use it. And yeah, we didn't see it really on stream very much, especially in the games that we casted. But to me, it still obviously feels like a fairly relevant composition and team. Of course, the 2 players that made it into top 8 with it were Rafa from Canada, as well as Caleb Ryer. I think Rafa's team had a little bit more offense because he had Chi-Yu bundle as well as Flutter, whereas Caleb was basically using, I think, the same 6 as Gabriel Gatti from EUIC. I think the main thing is, that I'm always curious about is how did these teams kind of adapt after these major tournaments? I think we've seen some players actually drop Haze from Palafin, for example. So Caleb Ryer, who finished in the top 8, actually had Taunt, for example. And then Rafa had the standard Jet Punch, Wave Crash, Haze Protect set, but he did have Grass Terra on Palafin rather than Water Terra. To me, at the end of the day, usage just may be dropping, but it can still perform obviously super well. For a lot of these teams, it's not obviously just about the Palafin, although it is a crucial member to these compositions.
Yeah, I feel like Palafin may be a little bit splashable when it comes down to some of the team compositions that it can be a part of. That also leads me to looking at another Pokemon that I felt like made more of a debut at Portland versus any other regional that we've seen so far this year. That's Azumarill. Did you expect that Azumarill might make a strong meta appearance at this regional? James, did you face any?
I think I faced 1 or 2. I know I faced at least Colin Hire in one of the Swiss rounds in day 1, and he was running like a Azumarill with Bombstone Trick Room team that he used to get like, I think it was
That's
like top
cool.
10 in the global challenge. So pretty reliable physical water type that, unlike Palafin, I think the thing about Palafin is, of course, you usually have to switch out Palafin for it to actually be able to do really a lot of damage. Sure, you can stay in with Palafin and maybe play protect games or just Jet Punch immediately. It is one thing where if you do get the turn wrong, you could actually lose a lot of momentum, where it's still really tricky, an uphill battle. So I think Azumarill is like a Pokemon that still does a lot of damage. It also has that fairy coverage, which is also really nice, and can just go straight for the damage unlike Palafin.
Yeah, definitely. I think we didn't see too many Azumarills at the very top of the event. I'm not sure there were any in the top 8 specifically, but a lot of notable players brought it. We saw it on stream a couple times. Gavin Michaels finished 16th place with it. He had a Life Orb variant. We often see Life Orb or Assault Vest, which is really interesting, I think, mainly because Azumarill back in the day in VGC, so many people use like belly drum sets, but it's obviously a lot harder to set up and and you get a little bit less coverage as well. So Gavin ended up finishing the top 16 with it. Randy Qua finished 18th place with it as well. He was using a choice band set, and then Colin was using the assault vest set. So it's pretty cool. All very well known, used 3 completely different items on it. I think that in itself really caught my eye. I think in general, in terms of Portland, the main thing that I talked a lot about on stream was the rise of weather. We saw sun, sand, and snow all finish in the top 8. I just can't remember the last time in VGC where it felt like all the weathers have been super relevant in a meta. And so looking at how all of these different weather teams operate is really interesting. And of course, we have to talk about Joe's winning team from the tournament. He managed to use Jumpluff plus Torkoal and kind of this really hyper offense aggressive team with Choice Scarf, Great Tusk, Choice Specs, Fluttermane, as well as Chien-Pao and King Gambit to round things out. But the Jumpluff looked really good in a lot of the games that Joe brought it out in, even when it missed attacks.
Yeah, that's for sure. I really liked the Leaf Storms that it kept going for. I don't think I've ever seen a Jumpluff be able to put out that much damage, and as long as they hit, hey, Jumpluff was definitely doing some Jumpluff things. But I feel like when you look at Joe's team overall, it just honestly sticks out to me as something that is really familiar for him. And I feel like when we look at a lot of the top players that are in these tournaments, that's something that you have to look at is like the comfortability level of playing around with each of those different pieces.
Yeah, so I think Jumpluff is really cool. I think one of the buffs this generation, of course, is Jumpluff getting Tailwind, which is absolutely huge because it allows you to have speed control with like Great Tusk and Fluttermane, where if opponents had like priority Tailwind, for instance, it would be really tricky because Fluttermane and Great Tusk aren't exactly the best bulk wise. I think it's really cool to see that Jumpluff gets Tailwind and also Sleep Powder and Encore. It's a pretty deadly combination because if you want to play around the Sleep Powder by protecting, then you have to fear the Encore afterwards. So it's a really threatening Pokemon because it can just limit the options that you have and force maybe switch outs. But if you're switching out, of course, as well, Sleep Powder is also a threat. So something that you just have to eliminate carefully. But the problem is Fluttermane and Great Tusk, especially with the Sun Boost, the Photosynthesis, just doing a lot of damage. And I think the Fisher Torkoal is interesting as well because you don't really need to chip damage with this Torkoal, and it's not like Lilligant Torkoal where you're going for After You, Eruption, and Heat Wave for the damage output. Really, Fluttermane and Great Tusk in the Sun can just dish out knockouts. So if your opponent has to respect them and try to knock them out quickly. But if you don't respect a Torkoal, the Fisher, one Fisher could just lose you the game instantly, and just threatening a knockout is super scary. So overall, that's how I felt this team was pretty strong, like just pressure wise.
Yeah, it felt like as soon as Joe was able to get the leads, like I feel like Aaron, you and I often commented on the fact that Joe had great offensive pressure as well as just getting the reads right in almost every single game we casted of him. But there's one more decision on this team that I feel like was really interesting and very calculated, and that was the eject pack on the Torkoal. So the idea behind that is if you overheat, you drop your stats, and then the eject pack takes you out of the game so that you have a free switch in. And we actually saw that work a few times.
Yeah, I liked it a lot, right? The idea is so many people often use Torkoal just as like a sweeper with Charcoal and, you know, a Choice Specs or Eruption, but there's no trick room here. So Torkoal is often going to be attacking last or close to last. What this team does such a good job of is the Paradox Mons. It's pretty rare for you to get a lot of value out of the abilities, right? Unless you obviously have a booster energy. But with Torkoal synergizing perfectly with it, like Jumpluff Torkoal, such an oppressive lead. You can pressure Sleep Powder, you can pressure Tailwind. It's pretty difficult to actually get a one-hit knockout onto Torkoal because it's just pretty bulky. It can overheat and then immediately switch into either Tusk or Flutter, both which immediately get that photosynthesis boost as well. You know, we've seen Sun plus the Paradox Mons before, but Jumpluff like really completes things here just because it makes Jumpluff and Torkoal such a flexible and scary lead. And yeah, I think like Joe led so well with this team. I felt like I saw him mix up his leads like so constantly. I think in the finals, he went with 3 different leads across the 3 different games. And so, you know, this team is really fast paced. You don't have Protect on King Gambit, Flutter, or Tusk. And so you do have to find ways to kind of position them well. But the eject pack certainly helps because it's a lot harder, I think, to manually switch with this team.
Yeah, it makes it even harder, I feel like, when you end up looking down at some of your opponent's teams that you have as well. First off, though, congratulations to Joseph Ugarte, who won the Portland Regional Championships. And with that team, not only was third time the charm, because it did take him a couple of times getting back-to-back-to-back finalist positions, but he was really able to come with something that had proven strong. But what about Zishwolf Ding's team? I don't know how you feel about DonBOZO and Tatsugiri still being around, and especially with the Glamora as well. I feel like it's just putting on so much damage.
I think for me personally, fought against, you know, a variant of this team at EUIC, the one that finished in the top 4. That one had Dragonite over Flutter. And it's just really hard to fight against. Like, there's so much flexibility in the amount of different combos you can go with. G-Schwal, for example, you can go Bundo Chiyu as a lead. Glamora is really flexible, and I feel like Glamora just is in a pretty good place in the meta right now as well. Although Great Tusk has been rising, so maybe then it makes Glamora a little bit harder to use, especially because we saw kind of the interaction between Joe and, you know, with his Great Tusk Tusk against this Glimmora. But overall, like, yeah, this DonBOZO just feels really consistent. I think it is still one of the best ways to run Dozo right now in the format, so I'm not surprised to see it do so well in this event in particular. It is interesting to see like Dragonite being dropped, for example, for Flutter main, but Flutter is just so flexible, and if you look at the top 8 teams, everyone had Flutter main here, and so it continues to just be a really good Pokemon in the format.
Yeah, DonBOZO is still absolutely strong. We actually saw a couple. It's actually kind of funny. I didn't face a single DonBOZO in the 14 rounds of Swiss that I played, so
Wow.
But there were actually quite a few DonBOZO in day 2. We saw the standard DonBOZOs with like the offensive like Glimmora, the Dragonite, Chi-Yu stuff. We've seen like Zachary Thornburg, who's still running like a Parish version of DonBOZO. He ended up finishing in the top 32 with Flamingo. It's definitely a Pokemon that's still relevant, and I think it's just a Pokemon that also gives Palafin balance a lot of trouble, unless the Palafin has Terra Grass specifically with Haze, or if they're running Clear Smog Amoonguss, because that DonBOZO set it's really hard for them to actually stop.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. That's definitely why we saw like Gabriel Gotti talked about his choice of putting the Clear Smog on the Amoonguss over Protect. Feels a little risky to me, but ended up working out for him. There were actually 8 DonBOZO Tatsugiri out of the 41 teams that made it forward to day 2. Maybe it makes a little sense that you didn't face one, as it is a little bit slim in the field, but it's also really weird because that's a lot of DonBOZO.
Yeah, I think it's still just a really good Pokemon and a tough strategy to be, especially when there's so much flexibility around the pieces in terms of like whether you commit to like bundle Chi-Yu as a lead or DonBOZO. There's just a lot of different ways you can play against or use that team. One of the main interesting things is kind of this adaptation for a lot of players to use Oblivious Grass Terra. Looking at the top 8, you know, so many of them were Oblivious with Grass Terra. There are still a couple of other, you know, different ways to run it. For example, Lev Willie used the Dragon Terra with Order Up, substitute Earthquake and Protect. Caitlin Brown actually had a really interesting one with Lumberry, as well as Steel Terra with Wave Crash, Protect, Rock Slide, and Heavy Slam. It's kind of meant to just do a lot of damage. You know, you don't have recovery, obviously, with the leftovers on a set like that, but the idea is to overwhelm your opponent with offense a little bit quicker. So there's still a lot of different ways you can run DonBOZO, but it feels like the overwhelming favorite right now is Grass Terra with Wave Crash, EQ, Terra Blast, Protect, leftovers, and Oblivious. And so that's definitely something players should prepare for if they're playing for, you know, subsequent events in the future. But quickly just highlighting some of the other teams in the top 8. I actually thought the diversity in the top 8 was really cool to see. Ofamezi, who finished in 3rd place, had Murkrow for Manual Sun, which he used to enable with Choice Scarf, Great Tusk, and then he had Water Terra, Golden Go with Nasty Plot, and this Gyarados with Terra Blast and Taunt. So the idea is that it's good support, but can actually also deal pretty significant damage. And then at 4th place, Nick Navarre, one of the best, most consistent players this season, using Snow featuring Choice Specs Iron Bundle, as well as Focus Sash Abomasnow. Specs Bundle, I think, is a really interesting call. I've seen a lot of people use Abomasnow Bundle recently, have not really seen Specs specifically used on it, and that thing just does so much damage, especially when you combo things like Helping Hand from Abomasnow, Ice Terra from Bundle, as well as the Choice Specs boost itself.
That's Sleep Talk too. I don't know what you think of that, James, or whatever else you were seeing in top 8, but I just had to point out the Sleep Talk on the Iron Bundle, so just in case, with all the sleep powders running around.
Yeah, it makes sense. Snow was actually used a lot in the global challenges recently. I know Japan actually liked it quite a bit, and the idea is Helping Hand with Abomasnow and the Terra Ice Choice Specs bundle. Blizzard actually can Oko Flutter Mane, which is,
wow,
I think, crazy calc when you think about it. Yeah, and when you think about it, Flutter Mane has base 135 special defense. So when you're able to Oko a Flutter Mane with a spread attack and do a lot of damage to the partners, which common ones are like a Moongus, it does like 50% to Arcanines. It is a pretty strong Pokemon. Interesting not to see Icy Wind. You don't really need speed because this team is pretty fast with the Scarf Tusk and the speed booster energy on the Flutter Mane. So I guess since you don't need Icy Wind, you can just get away with like having Sleep Talk because you're probably just clicking Blizzard, Freeze Dry, or Hydro Pump most of the time anyway with this team.
I talked to Nick about this in his run after the event had concluded, and he said he actually high rolled quite a bit heading into the top 8. When he faced Ashton Cox for like the last round of Swiss, day number 1, and then they faced each other again in day 2. Both Ashton and Nick are similar accounts where Nick just got a little lucky, but it obviously still takes skill to be able to play from a forward position or an advantageous position. So definitely not taking away from Nick's skill, but I think that's some important context to have there, especially knowing that there are a couple of moves on this team that are not necessarily 100% accurate.
Well, I think you make your luck, right? Like when you're using Bundle Abomasnow, Bundle is one of the fastest Pokemon in the format. And so Blizzard's chance to freeze, especially when you're clicking it multiple times over the course of a set, you are going to get freezes, right? and with Iron Bundle moving first, even a single freeze can drastically change the game. It makes a lot of sense that he maybe had some good fortune as well, and like maybe you notice it more because you're moving first so frequently. So many fast Pokemon on the team between Scarf, Rockslide, Grey Tusk as well. And the last thing I want to call out about his team was this really interesting Dragonite set. The Choice Band multi-scale rather than Inner Focus, normal Terra, and you have Extreme Speed, but he also had Facade, Aquajet, and Outrage. I feel like this was pretty non-traditional for Dragonite sets, and yeah, I think that a lot of those moves ended up being fairly relevant in his games as well. Aquajet is an option because I think most people generally have not had experience fighting against it. Overall, I think both between the bundle and the Dragonite as well as Abomasnow, it's a really cool team overall. And then to round out the top 8, we also saw Navjoshi use a Citrus Berry Annihilate with Bulk Up, Safety Goggles, Nasty Plot Chi-Yu, which is amazing into a lot of the Palafin balance teams once you Terra Chi-Yu. And then of course Encore Disable Grass Terra Booster Energy Screamtail, which looked really impressive, I believe, in one of his games on stream.
Yeah, I remember that game, and I thought it was really neat to be able to see the Screamtail. It basically just sat on the field forever. Like as soon as it entered in turn number 1, it was able to just sit there and go for Encore, Disable, and Protect, and just kind of keep spamming away at those moves. We even saw it use the Dazzling Gleam, but it was really underwhelming damage output from that kind of Pokemon. I think this team overall is super, super cool.
Yeah, he's been working on it for a couple of weeks. I've actually talked to him about the team before Portland, and yeah, like it's a really strong concept. Being able to use Screamtail with the Encore Disable against, like, for instance, some of the bigger threats like Choice Specs Flutter Mane, you could just protect on a move, then they'll go for an attack, and then even if it's like a Moongus next to that tries to Rage Powder, you could just Terra Grass and then disable the Choice Specs attack, and then the Flutter Mane's useless. You can set up one of your Pokemon. So overall, I think it's a really strong concept of a team.
A good point to bring up as well, how many choice items there are. We have like Choice Band, Choice Specs that are really 2 big heavy hitting offensive items, but then you have like the Choice Scarf as well for speed, and just a lot of times these Pokemon that are locking themselves into one move, which is another reason why I feel like the Screamtail was able to do so well for this particular team. I have to say my personal favorite top 8 team was Len Duels with the Lycanroc and Tyranitar, Aaron.
Yeah, to round out the other weather teams we've talked about, Len brought T-Tar, Lycanroc. This was a duel that, you know, some players have been using for a while, especially in best of 1 online play. Feels like it was picking up in Japan in particular. For Len, he's, you know, used bulky Tyranitar for like over a decade in his career, as well as Garchomp. And so, you know, after EUIC, I was talking to him and he was like, I think I kind of have to go back to the basics of what I'm really comfortable and familiar with. And yeah, he had a really deep run. Lycanroc is just really scary to go up against. And for Len, he ran Protect instead of Endure. And the idea is with Endeavor, you can often just get things down to 1 HP. That makes the matchup against DonBOZO a little bit scarier for the Dozo players. And then he had this really bulky Corviknight with Tailwind, Roost, Body Press, and Brave Bird. So the idea is it can set up speed control for the rest of the team, allowing Tyranitar and Garchomp to outspeed things while also healing up as well. A lot of bulk to work with. Similarly, you know, we were talking about Nick's team with Snow and being able to freeze. Well, Lycanroc with Rock Slide, every time I go up against this Pokemon, I always like hold my breath after it clicks Rock Slide because I'm like, something's probably getting flinched here. And so having flinch chances honestly really greatly increases your chances of winning the game as well, because, you know, every time you click Rock Slide, it's a 30% chance to flinch either Pokemon, right? Like those odds honestly stack up very quickly.
It really does. As an experience, I actually played Len at
Oh, did
Portland.
you?
And Lycanroc kind of didn't make my team move. So, but you know, again, when you're dealing with like these fast threats, like there is going to be some luck involved. Like you're going to have to fight through the odds. But overall, like I think seeing all the weather teams is cool. We had Gavin in the top 16 with Rain as well, but not Palafin Rain, Azumarill Rain with Life Orb. Just overall weather is pretty cool. We saw like 2 versions of Sun, one with Torkoal, one with Manual Sun. When we saw the Palafin balance, we actually see 3 in a row, 7, 8, and 9. Caleb running more of a standard one. Raphael is actually running, I believe, a version. I don't remember which Japanese player used it in the Global Challenge, but they did use like a Palafin balance, but with a Chi-Yu and Bundle as an addition. And the idea is to have like more offensive pressure and just like, you know, the standard, so you don't have to always go like the defensive switching route. And then Cedric kind of running basically what we saw Gabriel Legata use at the European International Championship Championship, I think, is pretty much the exact same sets, except maybe Ruination, I think, is a new addition on the Tinglu.
Yeah, I'd say, we've talked a lot about like the top 8 teams specifically, but kind of my big trends coming out of this event are, one, the top 8 was actually incredibly diverse, right? Three different kinds of weather represented, a Screamtail team with Annihilate represented, DonBOZO represented, Palafin Balance represented. So feels like the meta is still really wide open, and as is with the format like this, Palafin in general's usage has decreased substantially at a high level in North America, but it's still solid, right? 3 players ended up with an 11-3 record with it, even though there were only, once again, like 4 in the top in day 2 over 40 players. Like 3 of them performed incredibly well. Flutter obviously everywhere still. This Pokemon's not going anywhere. It was on all of the top 8 teams. That's a clear trend. DonBOZO still really, really good as well. We saw one obviously make it to the finals, but I feel like when I started Regulation C, I'd kind of written DonBOZO off a little bit, but this variant is still just really strong. And if I were preparing for a tournament that's like one of the top 2 or top 3 teams, I would definitely want to have like a solid game plan or matchup against. That's something to consider as well. And then finally, just some other like unique picks that caught my eye looking at, the rest of the teams. Scott Iwafuchi ended up finishing in top 10 or 10th place specifically with a Armarouge featuring Trick Room, Will-O-Wisp, Psyshock, and Heatwave, which I think is really interesting. Armarouge obviously has decreased in usage. Now let the Room Pokemon exist, but Scott's variant's pretty unique. Jose Vasquez here actually had a Scizor as well, one of my all-time favorite mons, and he had Bullet Punch, Pounce, Swords Dance, and Protect with safety goggles, so able to set up against Amoonguss and Jumpluff as well, I guess, theoretically now, now that it's won a tournament as well. And then Grant Weldon with Farigiraf here at 23rd place with a 10-4 record. He used Hyper Voice, Dazzling Gleam, Trick Room, and Imprison. So you can use it to imprison opposing Trick Room users, but also being able to imprison Fluttermane's Dazzling Gleam, I think, is pretty funny.
I just really like that a lot of the teams in our top maybe 16 actually had most of the Pokemon that were only featured once in day number 2. So like there's only one Abomasnow that was on Nick Navarre's team. There's only one Corviknight that was on Len Duel's team. Also Flamigo from Zachary Thornburg, that was one of, as well as the Halucha and the Ndidi and the Sandy Shocks, all one-ofs, but on Peter Chen's team. It just makes me really excited about the future Regulation C tournaments. I feel like there's just a lot to be able to choose and build from.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have different results. I guess this is a perfect time to segue into the Sao Paulo Regional Championship that also occurred. And there were, I think, quite a different story, I think, compared to Portland. There is definitely some unique meta choices in Sao Paulo.
The first thing, of course, that caught my eye is Orthworm won this tournament. Orthworm is something that David Kotesh, a very well-known player from Europe, piloted at EUIC. He, in my eyes, was like the first really high-level player to feature this Pokemon, and since then, I think people realized, hey, like this is really strong. Orthworm in itself can have a decent matchup into Fluttermane because you can just survive a Shadow Ball and retaliate back with a Heavy Slam, and of course, you've got a lot of different Pokemon that can use ground-type attacks to heal it back as well, whether it be Bulldoze Gyarados, Earthquake Tinglu, or Earthquake Dragonite. The team is pretty similar to David's. I think it's actually the same 6 Pokemon, if I remember correctly, but I am really happy to see it get a title. It's really cool Orthworm and Jumpluff won on the same weekend.
I just want to put the record out there as well that there were 4 other Orthworm that made it into top 32.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
So there were 5 total Orthworm in top 32, and I think that is, one, just a really cool Pokemon to find success, but also I wasn't expecting that. I'm gonna be really honest.
Yeah, it's definitely more of a rare pick, but the fact that Orthworm being a ground immunity but also healing is absolutely incredible. High physical defense as well. Shed Tail is just a great move paired with Tinglu. So Orthworm doesn't have the best special defense, but just paired with Tinglu, being able to heal and then like Shed Tail into Dragonite. And I think one of the cool things about this team specifically is since the Dragonite, when it comes in, will have full health and behind a substitute, the multi-scale is actually in effect for a substitute. So it's a really big factor because that means the Dragonite substitute can actually live a lot of attacks, so you could get 1 or 2 Dragon Dances off. So it's actually really hard to stop. So it's not too surprising. It's just really powerful, and it's really good into like a lot of balanced teams as well, as we can see, just because like they can't really switch into ground type moves well and handle the Orthworm at the same time.
I actually ended up watching the finals between Joaquin Salerno and Paul Ruiz, where Joaquin was the one that had the Orthworm and ended up winning the Sao Paulo Regional Championships. And there's a great example of what you just described, James, where you see the Shed Tail go through, the Dragonite switches in, is able to stay behind the substitute for a few turns, and then the Orthworm gets to come back in and heal up next to the Tinglu with Earthquake. So you nailed it. It also had a Citrus Berry. After it went for this Shed Tail, since it takes half of its HP, it was also able to heal back up. And so you're able to kind of keep it safe for longer, knowing that you have another form of healing with the Earth Eater ability as well. That was the only thing that I had seen as just like a really neat part of his strategy. But he also didn't lean on the Orthworm every single time. Like he knew when to not bring it to a game.
Yeah, I think David had used this team at EUIC. It got on some people's radars, but I feel like people probably still weren't really like going out of their way to prepare for it because like James said, it's not exactly super common. Plays out in a different way than a lot of teams that people might conventionally have experience with. So I'm not surprised to see it win this entire tournament and have so much representation in day 2 as well, just because I think like it's something that people just don't have that much experience fighting against quite yet. But I will say now that it's won a regionals, you definitely should be prepared, at least for this Orthworm team in particular. I tried it out actually for the global challenge as well. So much raw strength and so much healing ability thanks to the multiple ground type attacks with it as well. Paul Ruiz, of course, a former world champion, finishing in 2nd place using the 6 that he brought to EUIC. And I thought Paul's team at EUIC was also really cool. One of the few MausApe Annihilate users. MausApe Annihilate always feels like that team that no one wants to go up against, but you also just like really don't see very much. But Paul has actually, brought it to multiple really strong finishes. He's got this Breaking Swipe, Booster Energy, Roaring Moon, as well as Leftovers, Nasty Plot, Water Terra, Golden Go. I feel like that's kind of the premier way to use Golden Go right now. Choice Specs usage has definitely decreased substantially. And then for the rest of top 8, some really interesting Pokemon, right? We've got Ceruledge here in 5th place. Bulk Up has been really common with that. That was a Pokemon that was trending upwards in like February in the previous format. We also have a Iron Moth here, as well as Corviknight at 7th place. And then Garganacl and Brute Bonnet in 8th place. So a lot of Pokemon that we haven't seen too much of recently, I feel like. And then Azumarill, which you called out, Rosemary, over in Portland, finishing 4th here as well.
I think this one's also interesting because Tiago, he actually played in the Victory April challenge, and it's the same 6. I don't know if it's the exact same sets, but in the VR tournament, he actually played Belly Drum Azumarill, which we mentioned before.
Oh, wow.
Like fell off. Yeah, and also had like Wide Lens, Population Bomb, Mouse Hold with Feint. It was Clear Amulet, Flash Fire, Arcanine. So I don't know if it's the exact same sets, but it's definitely a very tricky team because you probably don't know what to really expect because the Pokemon are kind of familiar, but like the sets are completely different, which changes the matchup for a lot of players, especially.
I actually did see a little bit of gameplay footage from Tiago, and he was running Belly Drum for this tournament, and he did manage to get the Belly Drum off a few times.
I love that. We were just talking about it, and now that's like, 4 high-level Azumarils that have finished well at these 2 tournaments, and all of them have had different sets: AV, Choice Band, Life Orb, and Belly Drum. So that's really, really cool. I didn't know that, actually. And I think what's also interesting is we're kind of talking about like Palafin usage, and it's been decreasing. There were 2 in the top 8 here, but I would say both of the Palafin teams here are a little bit different from some of the others that we've seen. I mean, with Kyle in 6th place, like, yeah, you do have Palafin, Arcanine, Amoonguss, and Flutter, but then it's Chimpao, Dragonite to round things out, rather than things like Tinglu or Baxcalibur, Roaring Moon, for example. Diego at 8th place had Brute Bonnet over Amoonguss, and then Garganacl as well. But then if you scroll down through like 12th through 16th place, a lot of kind of more standard Palafin teams that kind of we've expected to see. So what's also interesting about VGC is like regional metas, right? And it feels like in NA, a lot of the higher level players are now choosing to drop Palafin overall, but here in this tournament specifically, there were 6 Palafins in the top 16.
Yeah, so to talk through some of the stats that I have to compare like the regional differences. So you know how I said in Portland that there were 4 Palafin out of the top 41 teams? That puts them at 9.7% usage. There were 10 Palafin out of the top 32, and that's 31.25%. You look at some of the other Pokemon, I feel like you expect to see high in usage. So like Arcanine is topping the charts over there, as well as Amoonguss. It was a similar deal in North America as well for Portland, but Arcanine actually saw way less usage overall versus Sao Paulo. Arcanine was at 19.5 usage with 8 appearances, and that was over double. It was 17 Arcanine in the top 32 there for 53%. And I don't even want to talk about Flutter main. Like, I don't know how it happened, but 25 out of 32 teams at Sao Paulo had Flutter main. That is 78%.
I can't say I'm surprised. It is just such a good Pokemon to throw onto any team. You know, Flutter is really interesting to me because even though its usage is so high, I don't feel like you absolutely need to use it, and it's actually fairly frail as well. So it's not like it stays on the field and like just knocks out everything while not fainting either. Yeah, even though its usage rate is so high, like honestly don't mind it too much as a Pokemon. I do think it's interesting where it feels like the in-person meta right now has focused on choice specs and booster energy on Flutter. So much to the point where when I play against Flutter and like closed team sheet best of one, I'm always like, oh, okay, no booster energy, it's choice specs. But then they have like a secret focus sash, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you know, but that is one of the interesting things. I think for Flutter as well, I've seen a lot of shifts towards like really defensive variants, even some players who have run like max HP, max defense. I don't think the variants that have done well at these regionals have necessarily been that, but that's just something to potentially pay attention to if, yeah, you're looking to try to new ways to run Flutter main. Overall, this Pokemon still is really, really good.
Flutter main's just not going anywhere. I'm still thinking it'll probably be Portland. I think was an interesting outlier. There were definitely, I think, a lot of different teams, and I feel I noticed that with West Coast events. I feel like we'll probably see more usage this upcoming weekend. We tend to see more meta teams usually on the East Coast events, but we'll see.
Yeah, what do you guys expect to come through for Hartford? Because that's coming up pretty fast. Do you feel like anybody's going to be really taking all of the info from Sao Paulo and Portland to try to like metagame the metagame?
I think it's hard, especially with like not that much time between events. For me, if I were competing, I would use both events as a gut check on what I think will be popular at Hartford, right? Like I would expect people to maybe copy Joe's team or Joaquin's team with Jumpluff and Orthworms. So make sure I at least have some game plans against both of those, because I think part of the strength of these teams are players probably didn't have much experience fighting against like Jumpluff or Orthworms specifically. And so I think often that can really expose holes in team bowling. So I'd want to like maybe patch up my team to make sure I don't just get like absolutely demolished by both. Both Joe and Joaquin like brought Pokemon that weren't really seen that much in terms of usage before this tournament. So certainly possible. And I am curious to see where things go.
Yeah, it should definitely be interesting as we still have quite a bit. Like this series is actually pretty long. So I feel we're going to see more innovation. We already have seen a little bit, especially with like all the weather teams. Maybe we'll see more pickup, especially after Joe's win. Sun might be more common. We might see more Jumpluff. Maybe we'll see people go back to the Lilligant mode because I think Lilligant's still really strong here, but we'll find out, I guess.
I'm ready for Swift Swim Dreadnought to make a reappearance. Aaron Brock did it once. Like, come on, let's see the Pelipper and the Dreadnought.
I don't think our Aaron wants to see the Dreadnought come back. But
I was like, hey, that did actually really well at EUIC. That team was honestly one of the most creative teams I've seen this format. I am sad to have been on the losing end against it, but
sorry.
It is, yeah, all four weathers are viable, and I'm really excited to see if that continues to be the case, especially because in Sao Paulo, like there was actually no weather in the top 8 versus in North America, where we had 4 different teams have their ways to set up whether be Torkoal, Tyranitar, or the Abomasnow, or the Manual Sun from Murkrow. So really curious to see where things go from there. But I think we've been talking for quite a while. So kind of to wrap things up, what are your guys' biggest takeaways looking at both events?
So it doesn't really reflect in the usage stats, but I guess I'll say it since I was playing at Portland and I was having this conversation with a bunch of players. In Portland, for some reason, there were a lot of Screamtail apparently. Like everyone I talked to had like faced at least 2, and I feel it's definitely a unique choice right now. Most of them were probably the Encore Disable sets, which seem to line up with everything, but I think it's still a really strong combination. It really can punish DonBOZO. We saw like on stream, NJ definitely threatened DonBOZO with the Encore Disable because it's just really hard to knock out Screamtail one hit, and then you could just like, you know, you live one hit, you get the Encore, and then you can disable the move. So it's a pretty strong pick. And then the rise of Chi-Yu, I think Chi-Yu still absolutely insane. We saw it do really well in EUIC especially, and I think Portland had a lot of Chi-Yus that we've noticed. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more teams, again, going back to more Chi-Yu style, where it's just really strong, especially with like the Nasty Plot setup.
I'm looking at the Chiempao rise in usage that we saw over Portland. That was a Pokemon that wasn't even in the top 12%, or if it was at the very bottom end of it in terms of the first few Regulation C tournaments that we had. It's way onto a surprising number of teams in day 2. It was on 10 out of the 41 teams. I feel like that's kind of a testament to being able to have Dragonite be so strong, but also players starting to weave in other supportive pieces to really help make that particular duo strong. So that's the one that I'm looking at for me.
You know, the main takeaways I had coming out of Portland, at least, where weather is a lot more viable. It's not like represented that much, honestly. Like there aren't that many people using weather teams, but those that are had very good place finishes with it, right? In top 8. Palafin usage decreased substantially in North America. We've talked a lot about that. DonBOZO is still really good. good. And then in terms of like individual Pokemon that I'd want to be a little bit more prepared for now after both of these regionals, Jumpluff and Orthworm, obviously, both of those won. I think Annihilate is really scary. Personally, I feel like I always have a bad Corviknight matchup. There aren't that many players using it, but it's just something that I always struggle to go up against. And so Corviknight definitely something to watch out for as well. Annihilate, I feel like, is kind of sneaky where like there aren't that many people using it, but it can still be a nuisance. And I feel like a lot of people have actually often like having a more suboptimal Annihilate matchup just because they don't expect to see it as much. That's one Pokemon I've always been like, I feel like it could have a really deep run. Paul Ruiz has obviously done a really great job representing that Pokemon in particular. Yeah, those are, I think, a couple of my takeaways, but we've been talking for long enough. So thanks so much for joining us for this recap of both Portland and Sao Paulo regionals. Regulation C is not going anywhere anytime soon. We still have a couple of weeks left. Of course, leading up to North American internationals, we have a couple of regionals left across the world as well. So we're excited to see how the metagame develops from here. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to leave a like or subscribe to the channel. Give us any feedback down in the comment section below, and we'll see you next time.